Hey everybody, my name is Jared and I am a Master Mason in the state of Mississippi in the United States of America. And this is the Sit Lux pen from Edgar Alejandro over at Masonic Revival. And brethren, we need to talk. I think you've noticed before on this channel that while I'm always very particular about making sure I don't violate what the Grand Lodge of Mississippi would consider a Masonic secret, I'm also not shy about addressing some of the more stickier issues and answering the questions that many people like to bring to me through the channel. Well, nobody asked me this question, but rather I have seen something, especially here over the last few days on Facebook, and I want to address it myself. Brethren, we need to talk about gender reassignment. And brethren, if we're going to have this conversation, we have to stay on topic. You know, I never was a member of any sort of a debate club, and I don't really remember doing much more than maybe some mock trials inside of a social studies class. But what I do know is that if we get off on tangents and start talking about things that are not the actual matter at hand, we will find ourselves on very slippery slopes. So for the purpose of this video, I won't be talking about my own personal feelings about this policy or about any policies that may ever end up happening in my own jurisdiction. I'm going to address the matter at hand, and that's the only safe way to get through any kind of potentially sticky situation or topic. I have seen a lot of different posts made after the United Grand Lodge of England put out this gender reassignment policy. And I made my own post about this with a big stop sign because I think too many people, including brethren, are not taking the time to stop and think before they open their mouths. I told you before in this video about silence and circumspection that to me that wording means that you need to be silent and thoughtful, actually listening and participating in the communication process before you reply to it. So you need to be silent and circumspective before you react. I don't even know if that was a word, but you get my point. So let's talk a little bit about this policy. First off, educate yourself. Don't post a single word. Don't hit a like button. Don't hit an angry button. Don't do anything until you read the policy yourself. Educate yourself. It's not very long. Here it is. You can go to it on the United Grand Lodge of England's website. It's very simple. It's ugle.org.uk/gender-reassignment-policy. I have no idea what menu you have to go through to find it, but that is where you can actually read it. It is not long. It will take you all of a couple minutes to read it, and then you will know exactly what the policy says. So, now that you've read it, let me point out what I think ought to be the most important part of this entire policy, and that is the second sentence. It says, "It does not impose binding rules, and although it gives some general guidance on discrimination law, it does not constitute legal advice." Brethren, I am not a member of the UGLE, and heaven knows if you follow me on Facebook, there's been plenty of things that I've had misinformation about how the UGLE is run. But this seems very clear to me. In Mississippi, we would consider a sure enough law, a Masonic law, as something that appears in our bylaws. And we call that the Williams Digest of Laws. But this doesn't seem to be that. This seems to be just some general guidance policy, not something that's a hard and fast bylaw rule that lodges must follow, but rather that it explains what may occur if a lodge takes certain action, and therefore we think it's best for you to behave in this way or to react in this way, rather than in what might be many men's gut reaction. So let's cover some very important things. Important fact number one: if you do not live under the United Grand Lodge of England's jurisdiction, this policy has little impact on you. I can't say no impact, and we'll get back to that in just a minute, but very little impact. So much so that I personally, here in Mississippi, I'm not even worried about it. You know, something else we've talked about before is how each Grand Lodge is independent of the other. It's not a franchise system. I know we call the United Grand Lodge of England the premier Grand Lodge, or sometimes people even call it the Mother Grand Lodge of the world, and people enjoy the irony about calling it the Mother Grand Lodge when women can't join. But the point here is the United Grand Lodge of England can put into effect whatever policy they want. Your Grand Lodge does not have to follow it. It's not a franchise. The United Grand Lodge of England can't come out and say every Freemason has to wear aprons that have levels and rosettes on them or they're not a Freemason. It's just not going to happen. They can't come out and say you can't use a G inside the square and compasses or you're not a Freemason. There is no G in the square and compasses. It's just not going to happen. There's so much we already do different one from another that it's clear that the policies in one jurisdiction can't affect the other. So please don't think this is some sort of domino effect that's going to happen across everybody. And even if it does, remember the policy is just guidance. Number 2, what does the policy actually say? If you look at this quote from a news article, I want you to pay particular attention about how this quote lets us identify the fact that this policy is nothing more than a way to avoid lawsuits. It says, "It should also be noted that people who the law classifies as female will still be exempt from membership of the United Grand Lodge of England. They may, of course, become members of the 2 female-only Grand Lodges." And then this quote, which is pretty much the same thing. It says, it warns, speaking about the policy, that using a Mason's transition as a reason for excluding them from a men-only lodge would be unlawful discrimination and so could never constitute sufficient cause. So I don't really know of another way to read this than to say, brethren, understand that here in England there are specific guidelines on what constitutes the legal definition of male and female. And if the law identifies somebody as male, we need to be particular about this situation. And provides the guidance. To me, that's all that there is. Now, that's not to say there's still not some confusing aspects of this guidance policy that the UGLE has put out, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. So what does the policy actually say? Well, it says that if you are a man, born male, you can join the fraternity. That's who can still join Freemasonry. However, if you were born a female, and you have an operation or a procedure, whatever the proper terminology is, where the law in the United Kingdom classifies you as a male, that you can then also petition to join the fraternity. Further, it says that if you were born male and you became a Freemason and you took the obligations of a Master Mason, and sometime after that you decided that you wanted to have a gender reassignment procedure done, that you are not automatically removed from Freemasonry just because the law now classifies you as a woman, that you took the obligation and therefore you are still a Freemason no matter what you may look or how you may act. So that in part is where it's confusing. It's interesting to contemplate how the United Grand Lodge of England would, because of the law, want to be gentle with the concept of, hey, this person by the law is considered a male. We can't reject them from a men-only fraternity just because they had been born female. So that's the legal implications being discussed in that first portion. But then it's interesting to sort of flip that on its head almost and say, well, if you were male and then the law legally recognizes you as a woman, you can stay. Now, as I said, they seem to be relying on the concept that if you took the obligation, then it's binding until you are expelled, and that a simple gender reassignment doesn't do that. And I imagine there are some that are going to have issue with that, but we're moving past that for now. We just need to understand what the policy really does mean, and I'm sure in time it will be adjusted in the future, as all policies and procedures tend to be. So here, this is where we are, whether we can completely understand it or not. We know that if I was born and stay forever a man, I have the right to petition the Masonic fraternity under the UGLE. That if I were born a woman, but then legally, in the eyes of the law alone, become a man, then I can then petition to join the fraternity. And that if I had been born a male, joined the fraternity, and then afterwards decided I wanted to become a woman, I could not be kicked out of the fraternity simply because of my desire to have a gender reassignment completed. We're done. That is what the policy says. Now, on Facebook, I have seen a whole lot of but my obligation, but their obligations, but this, but landmarks and whatever else. We can argue that to the end of the world. As I read it, there are other portions of the obligation which I cannot share with you here due to what portions of ritual Mississippi considers to be secret, but there are other obligations that say that you're going to follow the rules set by the Grand Lodge. Very basic. So if the Grand Lodge makes a rule, then does not that rule in a way supersede other things? Because if the Grand Lodge changes the wording of your obligation, then the case is done, is it not? So take that for what that is worth, and let's look at it from another angle. What happens here in Mississippi if somebody walks up to the door and they want to come into lodge that night, and this person, from every aspect of what I can visually see, is a woman, and that person, it's going to kind of catch me off guard. I'm going to say, I apologize, but this isn't an open meeting. This is a fraternity. It's an organization of men, and you're welcome to come eat supper with us if you're hungry, but we can't let you into the meeting. And then that person says, brother, I understand why you might feel that way, but I am a member of the United Grand Lodge of England, and I am a Freemason, and here is my dues card, and I can be examined if you need to put me through the trial of questions and answers to see whether or not I actually am a Freemason. Well, now what am I supposed to do? Because here in Mississippi, it is explicitly not permitted for a woman to sit in lodge. So now what? I have a card-carrying member from somebody who's recognized in their jurisdiction as a Freemason. We are in fraternal correspondence. We have fraternal relations with that Grand Lodge, and therefore this person has the right to request to be let into our lodge. So what do? It's not that hard, brethren. All I do is say, brother, I recognize you as a Freemason from United Grand Lodge of England, but my Grand Lodge does not permit me to allow you to sit in open lodge with us. Would you like to come have supper with us? It's not complicated. It does not involve a bunch of stomping around, gnarling and gnashing of teeth, and throwing papers up in the air out of exasperation. All it takes is a simple understanding and recognition of, I understand and recognize that your Grand Lodge recognizes you, and I'm happy to shake your hand and thank you for taking the obligation that I took. But here, I cannot allow you to sit in lodge. It's not that hard. Whether it's a complicated thing on an individual basis, not everybody's personality is good with dealing with potential conflict. Hey, I get that. But we ought not to be putting people up in the East that can't actually be leaders. So this is something we should be thinking about, not only as we're letting men through the West Gate, but also as we're promoting them and putting them in the line in lodge. We need to make sure that we're actually promoting leaders, people who can take that stance and can talk calmly and rationally with other human beings, no matter what their opinion is on their status or ability to attend a lodge meeting, people who can be genuine and sincere and help get through conflict in a very rational manner. Okay? So, at the end of the day, I think, and I'm speaking completely on my own here, I think the Grand Lodge of England realized that there was a potential for lawsuits. You already have seen that they've had the Enough is Enough campaign and all the other sort of things happening over there in England. And I think that they saw a potential gap in where they were vulnerable to a lawsuit. And so they issued this policy as guidance so that the Grand Lodge itself could say, hey, we counseled our individual lodges on how to handle something as sensitive as a gender reassignment, but that lodge didn't do it. So if you've got problems with the way they treated an individual, go talk to them. Sue them. Don't come all the way to the head of the table. Now, that's just my 2 cents. Maybe that's not what happened, but I'm telling you that's what it smells like, and that's what it quacks like, and that's what it looks like, and I'm saying that's probably a duck. But I don't know. I just don't know. So, we can have a whole nother conversation about the pros and cons, the benefits and the challenges of having co-masonry or universal Freemasonry or the other organizations out there that allow men and women to progress through Masonic degrees as complete equals. We can have that discussion another time. The purpose of this discussion is to understand this policy and what we do about it. So, quick recap, and I'll be done with this video. Read the policy. Don't say a single word, don't do anything until you've read it. Because if you're not informed, you're going to look like a fool on Facebook, and you're not doing yourself or the fraternity any good. Now, that's not exactly whispering in your ear, brother, but I'm telling you like it is. Read the policy. Know what you're talking about. Number 2, if you're not under the jurisdiction of the United Grand Lodge of England, the only way this could possibly affect you is if you have a visitor. And if you're worried about having a visitor because your Grand Lodge is very explicit about women not sitting in a Masonic lodge, then you just need to make sure that your worshipful master, your secretary, your principal officers are capable of being sincere, polite, and speaking with confidence as they tell somebody that they are unable to attend lodge that night. Okay? If you live in the United Grand Lodge of England, the general men-only fraternity thing is still there. If you're born a man, you can petition. If you were born a woman and you want to become a Freemason and you have a gender reassignment and the law, as I understand it, provides you with a certification, recognition that you are indeed male, then you have the right to petition for membership. However, lodges still have the ability to object or not. So it's possible that a lodge could let somebody not join the lodge, but the policy here is that it cannot be because they had a gender reassignment. So as a master of your lodge or as a leader in your lodge at whatever level, if that petition comes up, you need to make sure that the lodge is very clear about that it was not done because of the gender reassignment. If your Grand Lodge is like my Grand Lodge, nobody can be asked if they put in a black cube or black ball. Nobody can be asked why they did if it somehow becomes public knowledge that they did. So I imagine if it's the same in England, we can't have a discussion about why was this done. But it's a legal situation, not a fraternal situation. The lodge needs to be able to somehow clearly state, we held an anonymous vote, somebody put in a no vote, our policy says we cannot ask who did or why, and therefore the request to join was rejected. You have to be able to understand the legalities and follow the policy. Okay? All right, and then again, if you're in England and you are a man and you've already become a Freemason and you decide that you want to have a gender reassignment, then you can remain a Freemason. And here, at least in Mississippi, this is very, very different. Somebody would have to charge you with something to kick you out, or you don't pay your dues. So this is very different from getting in. While getting in Mississippi is anonymous, if you have charges laid against you in Mississippi, somebody has to do that, and it's going to be recorded who did it and why they did it. So the guidance from the United Grand Lodge of England to its subordinate lodges are essentially not a thou shalt not, but a be very careful, and we would advise you not to level charges against somebody for immoral conduct because they had a gender reassignment, and therefore we're going to kick them out of the lodge. As this policy reads, they're telling you you're opening yourself up for a discrimination lawsuit. Don't do it. So that is what we're working with. Nothing more, nothing less. There's no big floodgate opening up for all the women in the world to join Freemasonry. It is still, by and large, a little boys club, and we'll be just fine. Don't panic. So think about this for just a second. Let me leave you with one more thought. The articles I read claim that there's about 200,000 men in Freemasonry under the auspices of the United Grand Lodge of England. 200,000 of them. You figure what percentage, and I don't even have one, I'm not even going to go off on this, but let's say that nobody who ever has a gender reassignment before becoming a Freemason has actually made one. Let's assume that it all started with born males, naturally born males. So how many of those 200,000 of them are going to have gender reassignments? I don't know, but I'm guessing very few. All right, now out of those very few that have a gender reassignment, how many of them have the monetary and time capabilities to travel outside of their jurisdiction? It doesn't happen too much here in Mississippi. We only have 15,000 Masons, and unless you're one of the upper echelons or your employment has you travel around naturally, it just doesn't happen. Everybody goes to lodge in Mississippi, and I wager it's probably pretty much the same thing there under the UGLE as well. All right, so now you have this small amount of 200,000 people who decided to have a gender reassignment, and then a very small number of those people have the ability to travel. And then where are they going to travel to? One of the 180 other countries around the world? How do you know they're going to land in your lodge or in your jurisdiction? The whole point here is to think about the probabilities of it. I think too many people are getting worked up, like all of a sudden, next stated meeting, they're going to have a dozen women show up wanting access to the lodge because the UGLE recognizes them as Freemasons. It's just not going to happen. Brethren, take a breath, realize what is actually involved, and start having discussions at leadership levels on how to address this if it becomes a concern locally. Okay? All right, so I'm sure there are brethren from the UGLE who are watching tonight. There may even be some who are going under a gender reassignment or are thinking about it, or who may even be grateful that this policy came out because they've been wanting to have one for a dozen years, but they were scared about getting kicked out, and now this policy seems to give them the ability to do that thing they've always wanted to do. So, if you're out there, let me know. I'm interested to know what the brethren from the UGLE have to say about this. What other kind of guidance is being given at the local level? Are you getting the same sort of, hey, look, this is what the rules say, but really what are the odds of us having to deal with this kind of nonchalant approach to things? Or are you more in a situation where you're like, okay, we're fixing to have men who now look like women sitting in lodge with us? How do we feel about that? Are you having those kind of conversations? Let me know, but I'm telling you, don't post a single comment down below. I don't want to even see a first comment to this video unless you have gone to that website and read the stinking policy. Read it, then speak. Educate yourself. Be silent, be circumspective, and then share your thoughts. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch. We'll see you next time. Bye.